Alright, so here I have a triangle, a right triangle, and I'm asking you actually one of two things. I'm asking you to find the sine of x and also to find x. What is the difference between these two questions? Well, if I'm asking you to find the sine of x, I'm asking you to find the ratio of the opposite side to the hypotenuse with respect to the angle marked as x, right here. So if I wanted to find the sine of x, I'm just asking you for the ratio of opposite over hypotenuse. Therefore, it would be 10 over 22. And if we simplify that fraction, we get 5 to 11. So that would be the sine of x. But now if I'm asking you to find the actual value of x, that's something different. I'm actually asking you to find the degree measure of the angle marked as x. Now you haven't learned anything how to do this yet. So there's something that I'm going to introduce today called the inverse ratios. Okay, the inverse ratios. And the inverse ratios are basically the inverse operation of finding one of the trig ratios. So there's the sine ratio. Well, the inverse of taking the sine with respect to an angle would be finding the inverse sine, or what they call the arc sine. Okay, so the notation here would actually be sine to the -1 of x, and that means the arc sine, or the inverse sine of x. Now to do that, you could be done on the calculator or using the table. We're going to set it up the same way that we did set up the ratio. So if we look at the angle, we have the opposite side and the hypotenuse. So if I were going to find or make a relationship with respect to the angle marked as x, I'm going to have to use the sine. So I'm going to have to say the sine of x is equal to 10 over 22, just like we did in the first one. Now we need to get x by itself. We need to find that angle measure for x. And to do that, we need to undo the sine ratio by doing the arc sine, or the inverse sine. So what we would need to say is, okay, the inverse sine of x, x is going to equal the inverse sine of the ratio of 10 over 22. Now to solve this, we're just going to use our calculator. If we bring up our calculator here, and I have my graphing calculator, okay, I'm going to move it over so we can see what's going on. Okay. Now if you look at your calculator, above the sine, cosine, and tangent ratios, you'll see sine to the -1, cosine to the -1, and tangent to the -1. Those are the inverses of those ratios. So what we're looking to do, if I turn my calculator on, I'm going to do the inverse sine of 10 over 22. And actually, I should check my mode. Let's make sure. Nope, see, we're not in degree mode. Good thing we checked that. We should always make sure that we're in degree mode. So we're in degree mode. Come back to my screen. I'm looking at the inverse sine of 10 over 22. I just typed in that ratio that I set up. And we hit enter, and that means that x is approximately, oops, and how many degrees was it? Let's see. X would be approximately 27 degrees. So let's do a couple practice problems using the inverse sine. Okay, so remember to make sure that your calculators are in degree mode, because we're measuring the angles in degree mode. Okay. Now here we're told that the sine of x is equal to 0.7451. So what I want to do is I want to find the value of x, which would be the angle, one of the acute angles in the right triangle. So we have to undo the sine ratio by doing the arc sine, or the inverse sine. My pen's not working, sorry, hold on. Okay, so let's try this again. So if I wanted to find x, I'm going to do the inverse sine, or the arc sine, because that basically cancels out that sign, and we're left with x equals the arc sine of 0.7451. And all we're going to do is type that into our calculator. Okay, so if I bring up my calculator, and again make sure that we're in degree mode, which I am, I already had changed that. Okay, and we're going to do the second in sine to make sure that we have sine to the -1, right? And we're just going to type in 7.7451 and hit enter. So that angle is about 48.2 degrees. Okay, try the next two. Pause the video, try the next two on your calculator, make sure that we get the same result, and then hit play. So for number 2, we're going to do the inverse of the cosine of -0.5625, 124 degrees, and then the inverse tangent of 1.5882, and that's about 57.8 degrees. Okay? Easy enough. Now let's try this with using an actual triangle, finding an angle measure. Okay, so in this example, it says use the calculator to approximate the measure of angle A to the nearest tenth of a degree. So I'm going to put an X in for my angle A, and this is the angle that I'm looking for. Okay, so if I look at the sides that I do have, I know that 16 is the hypotenuse, and 10 would be considered what type of side? Is it the opposite or is it the adjacent? It is the adjacent. Okay. Which trig ratio is a comparison between or using the sides of adjacent and hypotenuse? Think about your SOH, CA, TOA, right? Which one should we be using here? Right, that should be the cosine. So we're going to set it up the same way that we set up when we were solving for missing sides. We're going to say, okay, well, the cosine of x is going to equal the adjacent of 10 over the hypotenuse of 16. Now, since I'm looking for the angle, I'm going to have to get rid of that cosine by using the inverse. So we're going to use the inverse of the cosine, or also known as the arc cosine. Okay. So that cancels that out, and we get x equals the inverse cosine of 10 over 16. And now this is just calculator work. So if I bring up my calculator, move it over here, and we're going to do, let's clear my screen, the inverse cosine of 10 over 16. Enter. And so the angle is approximately 51.3 degrees. Okay, so let's do one more like that. Again, we're asked to find angle A to the nearest tenth of a degree. So if I look at my angle A, I have the opposite side, and the adjacent side. So which ratio should we be using? Opposite and adjacent is the tangent, right? So the tangent of x is equal to the opposite of 15 over the adjacent of 11. So x is going to equal the inverse tangent of 15 over 11. And then we bring up our calculator, and we're going to do the inverse tangent of 15 over 11. And that's about 53.7 degrees. Okay? Please make sure that you remember the difference between when you use the inverse versus not the inverse. The inverse is getting us the angle measure. If you're just using the ratio, that's finding a side length for you. Given an angle, you can then find the missing side.